This September 2nd, 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of World War II, one of the most prominent wars in U.S. history. And in keeping in theme with my book, The Saints Who Built America, which demonstrates how much religion actually plays a role in our everyday lives and shaping world events, I've put together two harrowing and heartbreaking stories from that war's events to inspire you during this holiday season. Now, I also have details for you history buffs out there who really want to learn something esoteric and, details you won't find in a standard history book. For example, consider that just 5 Medals of Honors were awarded to Latter-day Saint service members during World War II. Now, when you adjust this for population density against all Medal of Honor recipients from the same conflict, Latter-day Saints are honored 137 times as frequently as compared with all other U.S. military volunteers during that conflict. And this data only becomes more appreciable when soldier saints are compared against all disciplinary records, dropout rates, less than honorable discharges from duty, and other similar metrics where Latter-day Saints are found to have the lowest numbers of infractions. But let's take this a bit further. In 1940, Latter-day Saints made up just 0.5% of the total U.S. population. However, at the height of World War II, just 5 years later, the Saints had doubled their membership. This is in spite of the fact that missionary efforts were largely discontinued in much of the world. European missions were closed, and missionaries recalled prior to the outbreak of military action. None were lost or harmed as the nation fell into chaos. Still, efforts to spread the gospel message continued at home and in non-warring nations. Historians Freeman and Wright record that during the conflict, the church emerged as an important beacon for religious values in America. Civic and other leaders regularly sought the church leaders for advice and counsel. And did you know, during the 1940s, Latter-day Saint church membership was diverse enough to make the Saints a global organization. And outside of the United States, the two countries with the largest Latter-day Saint populations were Canada, followed by Germany. As such, a number of German saints found themselves participants in the German war effort, mostly by forced conscription. Although the church was prominent in Germany at the time of the Second World War, the church was not trusted by the Nazi regime. Members of the church leadership were interrogated and at times imprisoned. Although in some cases the German government did take interest in the Mormon religion because of its work in genealogy. But overall, Nazi Germany left the saints alone with warnings not to get involved in politics. And with that bit of backdrop in place, let's get into our first story. The 1930s were a time of political and social reform, and when German saints looked on with interest as the political landscape of their country began to shift, they, like many Germans, were hopeful for a better future. But as the Nazi Party began to exert more influence over its people, some became wary of the direction the country was taking. Hillmuth Hübner was raised by his mother among the Latter-day Saints from a young age. She eventually remarried, but found her new husband disliked the church, which kept her from attending regular meetings. But Hübner continued his activity in the faith, attending weekly services with his grandmother. When the Nazis took power in 1933, Hübner was forced to give up his social activities in the Boy Scouts to join Hitler's youth program. It wasn't long before the young man began to question the ideas being taught by the party. By 1942, Hitler's grip on Germany was nearly absolute. The Second World War had entered its third year, and 1942 itself was a turning point. German troops were bogged down in Russia after the failed assaults on Moscow. The siege of Leningrad dragged into its second bitter winter. In the summer, Hitler's armies would push towards Stalingrad, while the North African Rommel's Afrika Corps fought desperately against the British at El Alamein. Far to the east, the United States had just entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and in June of 1942, American forces would fight Japan on the Battle of Midway, shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. It was in this atmosphere, as the Nazi machine reached both its peak and its breaking point, that Helmuth Hübner chose to act. At 16, Hübner began listening to German BBC radio stations reporting on the war and the state of Germany. This had been outlawed by the state, but the reports proved that what German citizens were being told was not the truth. This motivated the youthful saint to begin an education campaign in his community. He found like-minded individuals to help him, and they in turn began to embark on a dangerous task. Hübner had been volunteering as an assistant clerk in his church branch. This happened to be the largest branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Germany at the time. This allowed him access to a typewriter, which he kept at his home. With the help of his friends, who were also members of the church, Hübner, along with Rudolfo Wabe, Gerhard Duar, and Karl-Heinz Schnibe, implemented the use of carbon paper to create leaflets with BBC information about the war, the Nazi Party, and the destructions being waged against the nations. The boys' object was to correct lies being propagated by the National Socialist reports, the news broadcasts. In that same autumn, thousands of miles away, American and British forces landed in North Africa and Soviet armies began surrounding the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The tide of the war had turned. In the winter of 1941, Hübner and his friends foresaw the military defeat of Germany and decided that it was not enough to scatter leaflets calling on people to struggle against the National Socialist regime. They wanted to inform people how serious the situation really was. Hübner developed ideas for more than 20 leaflets over the next 6 months. The messages were short and often directed at officials. One leaflet read, "Make a decision. A decisive action can still save your people and country from the precipice to which Hitler has led it with his soothing words. Decide before it is too late." Hübner also took aim at Hitler, stating, "The Führer will send you by the thousands into the fires in order to finish the crime he started. By the thousands your wives and children will become widows and orphans, and for nothing." Such words were seditious under German law. But looking to expand their reach in January of 1942, Hübner, accompanied by Dürer, asked an acquaintance to translate the leaflets into French. The boys were seen in the act, and informants turned them both in to the Gestapo. All four were arrested on February 5th, 1942. They would spend the next months being interrogated, along with fellow saints from their church branch, and were subject to beatings, starvation, and given no bedding to rest on in their cells. Charges included various crimes under Nazi law. Conspiracy to commit high treason and treasonous acts were high priorities for the three-member Special People's Court in Berlin, sometimes referred to as the Blood Tribunals. With judges draped in blood-red robes, this court was infamous for a 90% conviction rate that resulted in the death penalty or hard labor. The defendants were not allowed to speak for themselves, and the defense lawyers often said nothing on the defendant's behalf. If a defendant were to attempt to speak, the court was known to shout them down into silence. Hübner and his friend's trial would last approximately 9 hours, upon which all four were found guilty. Hübner, now 17 years old, was sentenced to death. Wabe, Schnibe, and Dürer were sentenced to up to 10 years in labor camps, which was understood as a slow death sentence by itself. However, these three would survive to see the end of the war and go on to write of their experience and of their friend, Helmuth Hübner. Both Wabe and Schnibe recalled that Hübner, barely 17, without any social standing or military rank, shouted back at the president judge, Otto George Thierack, quote, "You have sentenced me to death for telling the truth. My time is now, but your time will come." According to Minert, both Wabe and Schnibe believed that Hübner had been particularly bold in court in an attempt to absorb the majority of the guilt and thus draw attention away from his friends. They had agreed in advance that if caught, they would do their best to shoulder the guilt individually and thus attempt to avoid burdening each other with guilt. The actions taken by Hübner echoed the sentiments that his faith was built on. From the Gospel of John 15:13, Jesus Christ taught, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. Hübner would be doing no less, not only for his friends, but for his country, and in defense of the peace of the world. As the day of his execution drew near, Hübner wrote several letters to family and friends. Only one has survived. It reads, "I am very grateful to my Heavenly Father that my miserable life will come to an end tonight. I could not bear it any longer anyway. My Father in heaven knows that I have done nothing wrong. I know that God lives, and he will be the just judge in this matter. I look forward to seeing you in a better world. Your friend and brother in the gospel, Helmuth." Hübner was put to death by guillotine on October 27, 1942. Author Alan Keeley once demonstrated the horror of the all-too-common brutality of the Second World War and its effect on people all over the world by this statement, quote, "Out of the silent intellectual German landscape, one faint but persistent query began to go up. Why? Why? Why?" Seldom before has the question been asked by so many, of so many, for so many years. As we approach a century since World War II, Helmuth Hübner has been remembered for his resistance to the Nazi regime. Memorial exhibits have been installed at a vocational school in Hamburg, at the German Resistance Memorial in Berlin, and at Plötzensee prison, where the execution took place. Additionally, a youth center, a school, and 2 streets in Hamburg bear his name. Since the 1940s, political, social, and religious groups have held various celebrations on January 8th, Hübner's birthday, and October 27th, his execution date, commemorating his heroism. On January 8, 2020, a school at a juvenile detention center near the Plötzensee prison was named in Hübner's honor, and students at Hamburg's administrative school now study the young man's life as a lesson in fundamental values, the values of a Latter-day Saint youth. Hübner's actions may not have affected the war, helped the Allies, or changed anything about the United States. Most citizens have probably never heard his name, but for those who do know his story, Hübner remains an inspiration. He and his friends taught us to not allow injustice to go unchecked, and to have courage to stand for truth in the face of extreme cruelty. Notably, Hübner's enlightened response to an unjust war was not violence, nor was he apathetic, as others had been. Instead, he and his like-minded friends engaged in peaceful education. By circulating information from BBC broadcasts, these 4 young Latter-day Saints took it upon themselves to change society by legitimate and moral means, even if that meant incurring the punishment of a shameless, brutal government. In an age of overwhelming darkness, one teenager chose not to be silent. He stood for truth, for freedom, and for faith. And in doing so, he left us with a legacy that still speaks nearly a century later. The truth does matter, even when it costs everything. Hübner's life is an example of youthful heroism. He reminds us that many of our nation's heroes did their greatest deeds while in their youth. Many of America's founding fathers were ages 18 to 30. Many great athletes achieved gold medals while in their teens and 20s. Even great scientists have often become known while relatively young. That is to say, the millions who answered the call of the war drum were mostly young and inexperienced soldiers. Each did what they could in a large effort to change the world. In their struggle, the cultivated character, beliefs, and attitudes of each could not help but be revealed. Such is the case for Captain Marvin S. Benyon, who commanded the battleship USS West Virginia, stationed at Oahu, Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor. He was also a Latter-day Saint, and in a biographical sketch, the final hours of Captain Benyon's life are detailed, based on conversations with officers and other men who were with him or who had been at Pearl Harbor, preparing to leave the ship to go to Sunday school and fast and testimony meeting in Honolulu, when a sailor on watch from the bridge nearby dashed in to report a Japanese air attack approaching at hand. Mervyn instantly gave the command, "To your battle stations." Then he ran to his own, the conning tower on the flag bridge. A minute later, Japanese torpedo planes flew in close from the outside, letting go 3 torpedoes that struck the West Virginia in rapid succession, tearing a great hole in the exposed side. Almost simultaneously, Japanese bombers flew overhead, barely clearing the masts, and hit the West Virginia, once in the region already damaged by the aerial torpedoes. Fortunately, that bomb did not explode. Otherwise, the ship would have been blown up, as was the Arizona, immediately astern of the West Virginia. To survey the damage, Captain Benyon stepped out of the door at the rear of the conning tower. He had scarcely taken 2 steps when he was hit by a splinter bomb, evidently dropped from a high level and exploding on a turret of the battleship Tennessee alongside the West Virginia. This splinter tore off the top of his stomach, and apparently a fragment hit his spine and his left hip, for he lost the use of his legs, and the hip appeared to be damaged. A pharmacist's mate put a simple dressing on the wound and tried to ease the pain. Lying on the deck, Captain Benyon refused to be evacuated and continued to give orders and instructions to his well-trained crew. The ship brought down 20 to 30 enemy planes. Captain Benyon and a seaman were the only crew members on the ship to die. During this time, while dying, he talked only of the ship and the men, how the fight was going, what guns were out of action, how to get them in operation again, about casualties in the gun crews, and how to replace them. He asked about who was wounded, what care the wounded were receiving, and provisions for evacuating them from the ship, as well as asking about the fate of other ships, the number of enemy planes shot down, the danger of fire from burning oil drifting around the West Virginia from the exploded Arizona. And then he expressed satisfaction over the handling of the ship, satisfaction with the effectiveness of the gun crews in shooting down attacking planes, and satisfaction with the conduct under fire of officers and men on board his ship. The courage of Captain Benyon has been remembered. His character was portrayed by actor Peter Firth in the 2001 film Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt posthumously awarded Captain Benyon the Medal of Honor. Admiral David Foote Sellers later wrote to Benyon's widow, quote, "His complete forgetfulness of self and devotion to duty to the last has given us a memory and set an example that will forever serve as an inspiration in years to come to the officers and men of the United States Navy." Movies and books have long depicted the heroism of well-known servicemen from the record of World War II veterans. But although the battles ended 80 years ago, some stories are only now being remembered. Such is the case for Ogden, Utah-born pharmacist's mate, 2nd Class George E. Wallum. Wallum was also a Medal of Honor recipient, and one of the few to ever survive the ordeals which produced the recognition. However, like so many valiant Latter-day Saints, his humility almost had his deeds forgotten to time. Wallum was the subject of a 2006 book titled The Quiet Hero, the untold Medal of Honor story of George E. Wallum at the Battle for Iwo Jima, written by author Gary W. Toyne. The book was well named. Even Wallum's wife had no idea she was dating a war hero who received the Medal of Honor until a friend had mentioned it. Wallum had wanted to serve as an airplane mechanic, but was sent to train as a medic instead. Seeing no course to pursue his first interest, Wallum threw himself into the work, volunteering with a battalion within the Fleet Marine Force, which used Navy hospital corpsmen as medics. Historian Katie Lang, writing for a news branch of the Department of Defense, illustrates, on February 19, 1945, Wallum's platoon, part of Company F, landed on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima to begin one of the fiercest battles in the Pacific Theater. Wallum said his unit was meant to be held in reserve, but the casualties were so numerous that they were sent in to battle the same day they landed. Quote, "I'll always remember getting there. I wasn't too far from the platoon leader, a lieutenant, and one of the platoon runners called over and said, 'Lieutenant, I lost my rifle coming out of the boat.' And the lieutenant said, 'Well, there are plenty of dead here. Go find one.'" On February 26, Wallum was painfully wounded by a grenade, but he stayed on the battlefield, moving well forward of the front line so he could carry a wounded Marine to safety despite heavy fire coming at him. Wallen tirelessly attended to his injured comrade, consistently disregarding any danger to himself from the barrage of shrapnel and bullets. When he learned that a nearby platoon had suffered heavy casualties, Wallen ignored the pounding of heavy mortars and the enemy rifles surrounding him to care for those men too. Working rapidly in an area swept by constant fire and treating 14 casualties before returning to his own platoon, his Medal of Honor recitation reads. It was amid this battlefield, these acts of sacrifice and acts of valor, that Marines would raise the American flag atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, February 23, 1945. The famous picture has since become an icon of U.S. military perseverance. The battle for Iwo Jima went on for weeks, and through it, Whalen was wounded several more times, yet he would not leave the battlefield and continued to render aid despite his injuries. Whalen continued on with his company the next day, taking part in a furious assault across 600 yards of open terrain. He repeatedly gave aid to his comrades, despite the firepower aimed at him, before being wounded a third time and by an artillery mortar. He recalls, "I went on to stand up to get to more injured Marines and fell down. I couldn't walk," Whalen said. "I looked down and my boot had been torn off. I'd been hit in the leg and later found out my leg had been broken." Whalen said he bandaged his own leg and gave himself a shot of morphine, then crawled about 50 yards to help another Marine. 332 hospital corpsmen were killed in action or died of their wounds, while another 659 were wounded badly enough to be evacuated. Whalen was one of only 2 corpsmen to survive and receive the Medal of Honor. And as some stories have been lost, others have managed to carry on and inspire new generations. In the case of Sergeant Benner Hall, his experience in war would inspire the 2003 movie, Saints and Soldiers. Having survived the war, Hall would relate the details of his war stories in his later years. He was 100 years old at the time. Hall explains, "What they did is they took a lot of these stories that happened in different places and put them all together in one place. The character who was used to depict Hall's experience was killed off in the film. Still, Hall's story is interesting because it tells us one account of an LDS soldier meeting another LDS member fighting on the side of his enemy. Journalist Daniel Wagner depicted the account as follows. Quote, Hall was protecting a damaged bridge over the Saar River in Germany. Sergeant Hall and a fellow soldier, Paul, were holed up in a 2-story house looking over the river. As Hall peered out the window, he saw 2 German soldiers across the bridge and began investigating nearby houses. When they approached the house where Hall was stationed, Hall gripped his carbine rifle tightly, peering through the sight as Paul went downstairs to confront them. Hall recounts, Paul stepped out of the door and told them to raise their hands. One of them threw his gun in the snow right away and raised his hands, but the other one started to raise his gun up to shoot Paul. So I had to shoot, he recalls. At the sound of the gunshot, the German who had laid down his gun fled down the snow-strewn street. Understanding that the soldier knew their location and posed a threat, Hall prepared to fire again. I aimed right in the middle of his back, fired, and he kept running. I fired again, he kept running. Then I thought, well, there's something wrong with my carbine. So I picked up my N1 rifle, shot 3 more times right in the middle of his back, and that confused me because I had become an expert on each weapon we had. I started to shoot 1 more time, but he ran behind a house. As Hall went downstairs to check on Paul, a U.S. patrol made their way down the street, the same German soldier in tow, his hands in the air. With the help of an interpreter, the soldier was interrogated and Hall learned he was a 16-year-old boy named Wilhelm who had been forced to fight in the war. When the patrols had seized Wilhelm, he had been crouched down behind a house praying. Hall was sometimes accused by his fellow soldiers of praying too much, but one thing they also knew about the sergeant was that he was an expert marksman. He generally didn't miss a shot. Later, during an interrogation of the young German soldier, Hall was surprised to discover that Wilhelm was a Latter-day Saint who had joined the church as a young boy with his family. A missionary from Sergeant Hall's home state of Arizona had come to Germany to teach them. Wilhelm was also quite surprised and delighted to meet another member of his church in such conditions as they were in. When asked what he was praying about while crouched behind the house, Wilhelm said, I was just thanking my Heavenly Father that I wasn't killed while running down the street." Although the young man was forced to fight in a conflict he wanted no part of, the saint carried his faith with him, and it would appear he was looked after somehow. Now, to close out, I thought I would include this last bit. The ending of World War II also marked a changing of the guard for the Church of Jesus Christ and its Latter-day Saints. Days after peace was declared, President of the Church Heber J. Grant finished his mortal ministry. He had led the church as the second longest serving president since Brigham Young and through some of its toughest times. Still, the saints thrived under his guidance, but his passage sparked a familiar tone among the Latter-day Saint community. They remembered that President Grant had taken on the charge of leading the church at the passing of another leader, whose life also ended at the completion of a world war. Of this event, Apostle Harold B. Lee addressed the saints and stated that President Joseph F. Smith should have died just 8 days after the ending of the so-called First World War in Europe, and President Heber J. Grant just 7 days following the ending of the Second World War in Europe, is not without deep significance. The ending of these great European conflicts apparently means also the beginning of a new era in the work of the kingdom of God on the earth. This notion would be met with little challenge in the years that followed, not just in the concern of warfare, but in the rapidly changing way of life of American citizens. Technologies, medicine, even culture would manage to advance with compounding inspiration that has still not ended here in the 21st century. And as we observe the history of advancements, it is interesting to observe the expansion of the Latter-day Saint faith alongside it. Well, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this. These stories were taken directly from my research, which form Chapter 8 of my book, The Saints Who Built America: How Sacred Foundations Shaped U.S. History. The chapter also contains powerful stories that are largely unknown about the Spanish-American War, World War I, and the Korean War, and how Latter-day Saints in those periods of our history have shaped the world we know today. And now, if you would, I would appreciate you leaving a like and a comment below. It'll help get this video out to more people and help promote and expand the channel. Until next time, this has been all about your faith.